you've ever trusted your own child more than your own life, listen to me for 3 seconds, because what I'm about to say cost me my bones, my home, and my illusion of motherhood. My name is Margaret Holloway, and I'm 74 years old. And tonight, I'm no longer telling this story as a mother trying to protect her son's image, but as a grandmother whose silence almost buried her alive. Because the truth is that betrayal does not always arrive screaming, it often walks in smiling, holding your hand, calling you mom. And I raised my son Julian Holloway with everything I had after his father died young, pouring my youth, my savings, my spine, and my future into that boy until my own reflection disappeared. And for decades I believed that love was enough to guarantee loyalty, because Julian was gentle once, artistic, the kind of child who built me crooked little wooden shelves and beamed like he'd invented shelter itself. And I kept those shelves even after they cracked, because to a mother broken, things still carry meaning. And when Julian married Serena Vale, I ignored the way my stomach tightened every time she smiled too politely, like someone measuring a room they planned to own later. And when they announced they were expecting their first baby, my heart exploded into something foolish and hopeful. And I thought maybe this was the season where all my sacrifices would finally circle back to me in warmth. So when they said they had found a house they love, bright, modern, expensive, I didn't hesitate. I signed papers I barely read. I placed my own home as leverage because that's what mothers do when they're still living inside an old promise that love repays itself. And the day I went to see that house, I brought a handmade quilt I stitched for the baby. Soft blue and gold, every stitch carrying a prayer, every thread a future I thought I was part of. But the moment I stepped inside that house, something felt wrong, because homes breathe. And that place didn't. It smelled like polish and ambition, not life. And Serena lifted the quilt with 2 fingers like it might stain her furniture. And Julian didn't defend me. He didn't smile the way he used to. He looked tired, distant, like a man already rehearsing detachment. And I felt small, but told myself not to overthink it, because mothers are trained to excuse what hurts them. And when I went to leave, standing at that immaculate door, Serena said casually that I should call B for visiting in the future. Not unkindly, not loudly, just precisely enough to redraw my place in their lives. And I laughed nervously, waiting for Julian to correct her, to say that's my mom, but he didn't. He stared past me like I was furniture he planned to rearrange later. And when I protested softly, when I reminded him that I had never needed permission to see my own child, something in his face hardened, like a door locking internally. And Serena stepped closer, her voice sharpening, telling me boundaries were healthy, telling me I was overwhelming, telling me their new family needed space from my intensity, and suddenly decades of love were being summarized as inconvenience. And I reached back for the quilt because it felt like the last piece of me in that house. And that's when Serena grabbed my wrist, hard, and I gasped not from pain but from disbelief. Because no one had ever touched me like that. And I looked to Julian, my son, the boy I carried through fevers and failures for rescue. But instead he grabbed my other arm, not gently, not hesitantly. And in that moment something inside me cracked louder than my bones ever would. Because I realized the hands that once held mine were now removing me. And they pushed me, together, not violently enough to call it an attack. Not gently enough to call it anything else, and the door closed behind me with a sound I still hear in my sleep. And the steps rushed up and the ground kissed me harder than my son had that day, and I lay there stunned, my hips screaming, my mouth tasting blood, waiting for the door to open again, waiting for remorse, for panic, for my name, but nothing came. And silence settled like a verdict. And I dragged myself to my car because pride is sometimes the last thing left intact. And I drove home shaking, crying, breaking in places no X-ray could capture. And hours later, when I checked my phone hoping for apology, there was only one message from Julian. Just 3 words that erased my motherhood. Don't come back. And something changed then. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Because grief has a way of clearing fog, and I saw him clearly for the first time. Not as my child, but as a man who had learned how to turn love into leverage. And as I sat alone in my chair that night, clutching my side, staring at the walls of the house I had risked for him, I understood a truth. No one warns mothers about that sometimes the child you raise grows up to become the danger you must survive, and, as pain throbbed through my body and fear whispered that I was alone, another feeling rose quietly beneath it. Colder, steadier, more frightening than grief. Because I remembered the documents I had signed, the power I still held without realizing it. And for the first time since giving birth, I wasn't thinking like a mother anymore. I was thinking like a woman who had just been pushed too far. And if you think this is where the story ends, you're wrong, because the fall didn't break me. It woke me up, and what I did next made my son realize too late that some doors, once closed on a mother, never open again. If you think the worst pain is being pushed to the ground by your own child, wait 3 seconds and hear me. Because the real cruelty begins when they pretend it never happened. I did not sleep that night. Not because of the pain in my hip, though it burned like fire beneath my skin, but because my mind kept replaying the sound of that door closing. And every time it echoed in my head, it rewrote my memories of motherhood. And I sat there in my living room, wrapped in a cardigan that still smelled like mothballs and home, staring at the phone that refused to light up with concern. And when dawn finally arrived, it didn't bring comfort, it brought clarity. Because the morning light showed me bruises I hadn't noticed in the dark. Fingerprints blooming purple and blue on my wrist like proof the universe refused to erase. And when I tried to stand, my leg buckled beneath me. A sharp scream tearing out of my throat before I could stop it. And that was when fear arrived, not fear of pain, but fear of being invisible. Because I realized if I collapsed right there, no one who mattered to me would know or care. And I dragged myself across the floor inch by inch like an animal that still wanted to live. And I remember thinking how strange it was that after 74 years, survival still felt like rebellion. And I called my neighbor Clara Winslow, a woman who had shared sugar and gossip with me for decades. And when she saw my face, she didn't ask polite questions. She didn't minimize. She didn't say family is family. She just said, "Who did this to you?" And that question alone cracked something open inside me. Because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged that what happened was real. And when I whispered my son's name, she didn't flinch. She didn't defend him. She helped me into her car and drove me to the clinic without another word. And as the doctor spoke about fractures and rest and recovery, my mind wandered back through years I had carefully framed as love. Years where I paid Julian's debts quietly, smoothed over his mistakes, defended his silence, and explained away Serena's coldness as modern manners I simply didn't understand. And sitting there with a brace around my hip, I understood how easily being supportive turns into erasing yourself. And the X-ray confirmed what my heart already knew, that something fundamental had broken. And when Clara asked if I wanted to call Julian, I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea of asking my attacker for comfort felt obscene. And later that afternoon, when the bank called, their tone polite but urgent, asking if I was aware that the mortgage account tied to my name had triggered an internal review, I felt something cold settle into my chest. Because suddenly all the puzzle pieces slid together. Serena's calculated smiles, Julian's rehearsed distance, the speed with which they'd accepted my signature. And I realized the house wasn't just a dream they wanted, it was leverage. And I was the collateral they weren't done needing. And when I hung up the phone, the room felt very quiet, not empty, but focused, like the moment before a storm changes direction. And I opened the drawer where I kept my late husband's documents, the ones I hadn't touched since his funeral. Because grief freezes things in place, and there it was, the agreement. My name inked neatly beside Julian's like a promise made to the wrong future. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel guilty for feeling angry. Because anger, I learned, is often just grief that finally learned how to stand up. And I didn't cry when Julian finally called later that evening. I listened. I heard the impatience under his fake concern. The way he asked about the bank confusion before he asked about my health. And when he said Serena was stressed and I should try not to upset her during the pregnancy. Something inside me went numb, because a mother can endure many insults. But being blamed for your own abuse rewires your soul. And I realized then that if I continued loving him the way I always had, I would not survive him. And that night, I did something radical, something terrifying. Something no one teaches mothers how to do. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my pain. And I started reading every line of those documents not as a mother, but as a person who deserved safety. And when the bank manager confirmed that my withdrawal would collapse their arrangement, my hands didn't shake the way I expected, because fear had already done its worst, and what replaced it was resolve. And I signed knowing exactly what it would cost him, knowing exactly what it would free me from, and when I put the pen down, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time, like someone stepping out of a burning house carrying only what they could save. And hours later, when my phone exploded with messages from Julian, accusations, pleas, threats, apologies that arrived too late and smelled like panic, I read them all without replying. Because silence, I learned, is sometimes the only language abusers understand. And as I deleted each message, I wasn't erasing my son. I was erasing the illusion that love without limits is noble. And when he finally showed up at my door demanding answers, pounding like entitlement itself, I didn't open it. I spoke through the wood with a voice I barely recognized. Calm, steady, finished, and I told him to leave. And when he screamed my name the way children do when they've lost something they thought was theirs forever, I felt no triumph, only relief, because the woman standing behind that door was no longer waiting to be chosen. And as the estate security escorted him away, shouting promises and curses in the same breath, I understood that consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like distance. And as I sat back down, heart racing, leg aching, I realized this story was no longer about what he did to me, but about what I would never allow again. And if you think reclaiming power brings instant peace, you're wrong, because the next truth I had to face was even harder, even more final, and it came not from my son, but from the future I now had to rewrite alone. And in part 3, I will tell you the decision that severed our bond forever, and why choosing myself cost me the title of mother, but saved my life. Asterisk asterisk. Asterisk. If you believe walking away is the hardest thing a mother can do, give me 3 seconds, because the real pain comes when you realize staying would have destroyed you. After the security lights faded and the echoes of Julian's shouting dissolved into the night, my house felt unfamiliar, not empty but stripped of illusion. And I sat alone with my injured hip throbbing like a second heartbeat, thinking about how quietly a lifetime can change direction. Because the hardest truth wasn't that my son had hurt me. It was that he had expected me to absorb it without consequence. And in the days that followed, I moved slowly, carefully, as if my body understood before my mind that I was stepping into a new life. One where love would no longer require my self-destruction. And Clara checked on me every morning, bringing soup and fierce encouragement. And each time she left, she reminded me that survival isn't selfish, it's sacred. And somewhere between the pain medication and the long silent afternoons, I began remembering moments I had buried for years. Julian dismissing my worries as drama, Serena correcting my words in public. The way decisions about my own life had slowly become group discussions I was always expected to lose, and I understood that the fall on those steps wasn't an accident of anger. It was the climax of a long pattern, and that realization hurt. more than the fracture ever could. Because it meant the betrayal wasn't sudden, it was cultivated. And when my lawyer Elaine Mercer sat across from me with her notebook open and her eyes kind but unflinching, I told her everything, not as a mother trying to soften details, but as a woman finally telling the truth without cushioning it. And when she said the words elder abuse, I felt something inside me recoil and then settle. Because naming a wound gives it shape, and shape makes it possible to heal. And Elaine explained my options, calmly restraining orders, financial protection, legal distance, and none of them sounded like revenge. They sounded like oxygen, and that was when she asked the question that made my hands go cold. Margaret, what do you want to do about your will? And for a moment, I couldn't answer, because mothers are taught that inheritance is proof of love, that leaving something behind is the final apology for every mistake. And yet when I imagined Julian standing over my grave, collecting what I had built after he had nearly destroyed me, my chest tightened in a way that felt like a warning, not grief. And I realized then that love given without accountability becomes permission. And I told Elaine to rewrite it, not in anger, not in spite, but in truth. Because I no longer wanted my life's work to reward cruelty. And as she wrote, I felt the weight of generations lifting. Because I wasn't just choosing myself, I was breaking a pattern that had taught women like me to endure until we vanished. And when the documents were finalized, I sat in my car afterward and cried, not because I had disowned my son, but because I had finally chosen not to abandon myself. And the news reached Julian faster than I expected. It always does. And when he called again, his voice was no longer furious. It was frightened, pleading, small. And for the first time, I heard the boy I used to know buried under entitlement. And for half a heartbeat, my resolve wavered. Because mothers are trained to rescue, even the ones who are drowning us. But then he said the words that sealed everything. You can't do this to me. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I hurt you. Just possession disguised as pain. And in that moment, the last thread snapped. Because love that refuses accountability is not love. It is hunger. And I told him calmly that I had already done it. And that he needed to stop contacting me. And when he threatened to show up again, I did not raise my voice. I told him the police would be involved. And the silence that followed was long and heavy. Like the pause after a door closes for the final time. And the weeks after were not peaceful the way movies promise. They were lonely, quiet, full of doubt and warning. Because even when you leave abuse, you grieve what you hoped it would become. And I mourn the son I thought I had, the grandmother I thought I'd be. The future I had stitched into that quilt now lost forever, but slowly. Something else grew in the space grief left behind, a sense of safety, of agency, of breath. And one afternoon, as I stood by the window watching sunlight spill across the floor, I realized I was no longer afraid of the sound of my own doorbell. And that was when I understood the truth. No one tells mothers that choosing yourself doesn't make you heartless. It makes you alive. And just when I believed the storm had passed, a letter arrived that proved cutting ties doesn't end the story. It escalates it because some people don't accept boundaries. They see them as challenges. And in part 4, I will tell you how my son tried one final time to reclaim control. And why that attempt cost him more than he ever imagined. ****. If you think silence teaches people remorse, give me 3 seconds. Because for some, it only sharpens their sense of entitlement. I had just begun to believe that distance would dull the danger, that cutting ties would allow the wound to scar over quietly. When the letter arrived, thick paper, formal tone, addressed to me by my full name as if authority could replace affection, and the moment I read the first line, I knew Julian was still trying to control the narrative, because the words were not written by a son seeking forgiveness, but by a man demanding correction, accusing me of confusion, of being manipulated by outsiders, of making irrational decisions due to age and injury. And as my hands trembled holding that paper, I realized this was no longer a family conflict. It was an attempt to erase my credibility, my agency, my very voice. And fear crept in then, not as panic, but as clarity, because I understood he wasn't trying to reconcile. He was trying to reclaim ownership. And I remembered every time I'd been told I was overreacting, too emotional, imagining things, and suddenly the pattern stretched back decades like a road. I had been walking blindfolded, and when Elaine read the letter her jaw tightened, because she recognized it for what it was, a legal threat wrapped in gaslight. And she told me plainly that Julian intended to contest my competency, to argue that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. And hearing that felt like being pushed down those steps all over again, because there is no deeper betrayal than having your own child try to turn your age into a weapon. And for a moment the old Margaret wanted to shrink, to apologize, to smooth it over the way I always had. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone quieter and far more dangerous, someone who had learned that survival requires firmness. And I authorized Elaine to respond. Not emotionally, not defensively, but decisively. And the response included medical records, witness statements, and documentation that left no room for doubt. And when Julian realized the door he was pounding on was reinforced with truth, his tactics shifted, because control seekers always pivot when confronted, and suddenly the messages softened, apologies appeared, memories were rewritten. And he spoke of love and family and forgiveness like someone reading from a script they didn't believe in. And it would have been easy, oh so easy, to fall for it, because motherhood conditions you to crave reconciliation like oxygen. But then I remembered lying on the ground bleeding while he chose silence, and I remembered how quickly concern vanished when money was secured. And that memory steadied me, and the court proceedings moved forward quietly, methodically. And Julian's attempt to paint me as fragile collapsed under evidence, because truth has weight. And when the ruling affirmed my autonomy without hesitation, I felt a release so profound it almost brought me to my knees. Not because I had won, but because I had been believed. And that night I slept without nightmares for the first time since the fall. And days later word reached me that the house Julian fought so hard to protect was officially gone. Foreclosed and empty, stripped of the illusion it once held. And I did not feel satisfaction, only a solemn acknowledgement that actions echo. And then came the final blow, the one he never expected, because accountability rarely arrives in the form we imagine. And when I established the foundation in my husband's name to support elderly women facing familial abuse, I didn't announce it publicly. I didn't weaponize it. I simply redirected my legacy toward protection instead of permission. And Julian found out the way abusers often do through consequences that cannot be argued away. And when he tried to contact me again, this time not as a son, but as a man facing the wreckage of his own choices, I did not answer, because peace is not found in final conversations. It is found in final boundaries. And as months passed and my body healed, I realized the deepest wound had closed too. Not because it stopped hurting, but because it stopped controlling me. And I began to live without flinching, without waiting for footsteps, without rehearsing apologies I no longer owe. And just when I thought the story had reached its quiet ending, life offered me something unexpected, not reconciliation, not revenge, but renewal in a form I never anticipated. And in part 5, I will tell you how losing my son led me to find myself again, and why survival sometimes creates a future more honest than love ever was. If you think surviving betrayal means spending the rest of your life hardened and alone, give me 3 seconds, because what I found on the other side of loss surprised even me. The quiet that followed Julian's disappearance from my life was not empty the way I feared. It was spacious, like a room finally cleared of furniture you were always tripping over. And as my body healed and my hip learned to trust me again, my spirit did too. Because without realizing it, I had spent decades shrinking my needs to keep someone else comfortable. And now there was space to breathe, to notice the way morning light touched my kitchen table, the way my own laughter sounded when no one rushed to silence it. And the foundation I created began its work quietly, helping women my age who had been told for years that suffering was part of love. And when they sat across from me telling stories that mirrored my own, I understood that my pain had not ended a legacy, it had redirected it. And one afternoon a young social worker asked me if it hurt to talk about my son. And I told her the truth that hurts less than pretending he never hurt me. Because healing does not come from erasing memory, it comes from honoring it honestly. And I no longer wake up wondering if I was too harsh or too cold. Because clarity replaces guilt when you stop negotiating your worth. And sometimes at night, I still think about the little boy Julian once was. The one who built crook shelves and asked me to check for monsters under his bed. And I grieve him, because grieving a living person is one of the quietest, loneliest pains there is. But grief no longer owns me, it visits and leaves. Like a wave that knows the shore is strong. And when people ask if I would take him back if he apologized, I don't answer quickly, because that question assumes love must always mean access. And I have learned that love can exist without proximity, without permission to harm, and my answer, when it comes, is simple: I wish him no suffering, but I will never again offer myself as the cost of his comfort. And that decision did not make me cruel. It made me free, and freedom, I discovered, is gentle. It does not demand explanations, it does not shout. It simply allows you to live without fear. And as I sit here now, a grandmother by age, but a woman reborn by choice, I no longer measure my life by what I gave away, but by what I protected. Because survival is not the absence of love, it is the presence of self. And if my story reaches you, if you are a mother, a grandmother, a daughter, or simply someone taught to endure too much, know this: you are allowed to close doors. You are allowed to choose yourself. And you are allowed to build a future that does not include those who broke you. Because sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stop sacrificing herself for people who would never bleed for her. And if you're still listening now, remember this: not every story about family is meant to end in reunion. Some are meant to end in awakening. And that awakening saved my life. If this story shook something inside you, don't ignore it, because silence is how pain survives and voices are how healing begins. And if you know someone who gives endlessly and feels invisible in return, share this with them as a reminder that love should never cost your safety or your dignity. And if you've lived through something similar, know that you are not weak for staying. As long as you did, you were strong for surviving, and stronger still for choosing yourself when you finally did. So take a moment to like this story, subscribe for more real voices that refuse to be erased, and leave a comment if this touched your heart. Because every shared truth makes it harder for abuse to hide and easier for someone else to finally walk away.